For centuries, the story we have been told about our modern world has been a deceptively simple one. It's a tale of European brilliance, a narrative where progress was born in the minds of European thinkers and innovators, seemingly out of nowhere. We learn about the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the Industrial Revolution as purely European achievements, moments when one continent single-handedly pulled the rest of humanity into the future. This version of history suggests that Europe possessed a unique cultural or intellectual spark that other civilizations simply lacked. It presents a clean, triumphant march forward led by visionary white men. This story, however, is a carefully constructed myth. It is a comforting and flattering tale for some, but it is fundamentally untrue. The idea of European exceptionalism, the belief that Europe's rise was self-generated and inevitable, deliberately erases the vast contributions of other cultures. It ignores the inconvenient truth that Europe's progress was not achieved in isolation. Instead, it was built upon a foundation of knowledge, resources, and wealth that was taken, often violently, from Asia, Africa, and the Americas. By celebrating only European achievements, we are not just telling a partial story, we are upholding a legacy of erasure. To understand the real story, we must ask uncomfortable questions. Whose labor built the grand cities and funded the scientific institutions of Europe? Whose ideas laid the groundwork for the so-called Age of Discovery? When we look closer, we find that the answers lead us far beyond the borders of Europe. They lead us to the bustling libraries of Baghdad, the advanced metallurgical workshops of ancient China, and the gold-rich mines of the Americas. The story of progress is not a European monologue. It is a global conversation, one in which many voices were silenced. The truth is that before its colonial expansion, Europe was not the center of the world. For much of the period we call the Dark Ages, it was a relatively fragmented and economically weak region compared to the powerful and sophisticated empires of the East. Civilizations in China, India, and the Islamic world were leaders in science, mathematics, and trade. The narrative of Europe as the sole engine of human advancement is a modern invention, designed to justify centuries of exploitation and to maintain a false sense of superiority that still affects our world today. The European Renaissance, often hailed as the rebirth of classical wisdom, was not a spontaneous awakening. It was, in reality, a moment of profound knowledge transfer from East to West. While Europe was experiencing a period of relative stagnation, the Islamic world was in its golden age. Scholars in cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba were not just preserving ancient Greek and Roman texts, they were expanding upon them, making groundbreaking discoveries in medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy. The Great House of Wisdom in Baghdad was a global center of learning that drew scholars from across the world. When European crusaders and traders traveled east, they encountered a world far more advanced than their own. They brought back not just spices and silks, but also priceless knowledge. The works of brilliant minds like Al-Khwarizmi, who developed algebra, and Al-Zarawi, whose surgical techniques were used in Europe for centuries, were translated into Latin. These texts became the cornerstones of European university curricula, directly fueling the intellectual fire of the Renaissance. Europe did not rediscover classical knowledge on its own. It was reintroduced to it through the meticulous work of Islamic scholars who had kept it alive. The debt extends far beyond the Islamic world. Key mathematical concepts that we now take for granted originated elsewhere. The number zero, a revolutionary idea that is the bedrock of modern mathematics and computing, was developed in India by the 5th century. The scholar Brahmagupta established its rules, and this knowledge traveled through the Islamic world before finally reaching Europe. Without the concept of zero, the complex calculations required for engineering, physics, and finance would have been impossible. This was not a minor contribution. It was a fundamental building block of modern science. Similarly, many of the technologies that enabled Europe's global expansion were pioneered elsewhere. Gunpowder, the magnetic compass, and printing were all invented in China, long before they appeared in Europe. These innovations were not simply copied. They were adopted and adapted, providing European nations with the military and navigational tools needed to launch their colonial projects. To frame these developments as examples of European genius is to ignore their true origins and erase the ingenuity of the people who created them first. The Renaissance was less a European invention and more a European inheritance. Europe's intellectual awakening was paid for with wealth that was stolen on an unimaginable scale. The economic foundations for the Industrial Revolution were not laid in the workshops of Manchester or the banks of London alone. They were forged in the brutal reality of colonial plunder. Before the Age of Empire, European economies were fragile. England, for example, faced bankruptcy in the 16th century. The continent's transformation into a global economic powerhouse was directly funded by the systematic looting of other lands and the enslavement of their people. This was not trade. It was a violent extraction of wealth. Consider the Americas. Between 1492 and 1800, Spanish colonizers shipped an estimated 180 tons of gold and 16,000 tons of silver back to Europe. This colossal influx of precious metals, worth trillions in today's money, destabilized local economies, but supercharged Europe's financial systems. In India, the British drained what economist Utsa Patnaik estimates to be the equivalent of over $45 trillion from the subcontinent through unfair taxes and trade manipulation. This stolen wealth flowed directly into Britain, funding everything from the steam engine to the expansion of its navy, while simultaneously dismantling India's world-leading textile industry. The most horrific engine of this wealth creation was the transatlantic slave trade. Over 3 centuries, between 12 and 15 million African men, women, and children were captured, chained, and forced onto ships. Millions died during the horrific journey. Those who survived were sold into a life of brutal, unpaid labor on plantations in the Americas. The profits from sugar, cotton, and tobacco, crops harvested by enslaved people, were astronomical. This immense wealth funded the banks, insurance companies, and industries that defined modern Europe. The suffering of African people was the fuel for European progress. This history of exploitation was justified by racist ideologies, such as the doctrine of discovery, a series of 15th-century papal bulls that gave Christian European nations the religious authority to conquer non-Christian lands and enslave their people. This created a moral and legal framework for centuries of violence. The human cost was staggering. Events like the British-engineered Bengal famine of 1770, which killed an estimated 10 million people, were not tragic accidents. They were the direct consequences of colonial policies designed to maximize profit at the expense of human lives. Europe's rise was inseparable from the suffering it inflicted. The legacy of this history is not confined to the past. The erasure of non-European contributions continues to shape our modern world, upholding harmful myths of white and European superiority. When we attribute innovations like electricity solely to figures like Thomas Edison, we ignore the full story. The development of such technologies depended on resources like copper and rubber extracted from colonies in Africa and Asia. It was financed by capital built on the profits of slavery and realized in a nation built on stolen indigenous land. The entire system that allowed for such genius to flourish was global and deeply exploitative. Ignoring these truths has real-world consequences. It fosters a sense of entitlement and historical amnesia in the descendants of colonizers, while invalidating the experiences and contributions of people of color. In the United States, this legacy lives on in the form of white Christian nationalism, an ideology that clings to the myth that the nation was intended for European Christians, even as demographics shift. This dangerous mindset is a direct heir to the colonial belief in racial and cultural hierarchies, and it stands in the way of building a truly inclusive society. To build a just and equitable future, we must first be honest about the past. This does not mean erasing the achievements of Europeans, but rather placing them in their proper context. It means acknowledging that progress has always been a collaborative global effort. It requires us to listen to the voices that have been silenced and to honor the immense sacrifices and innovations of the people whose lands and labor built the modern world. Understanding this shared history is not about assigning guilt. It is about accepting responsibility for the truth. Embracing a complete and honest account of our past is the only way forward. We must challenge the simple, comforting myths and replace them with the complex and often painful truth. By recognizing the foundational role that every culture has played in shaping our world, we can begin to dismantle the lasting structures of inequality that were built on a lie. Only then can we work together towards a future where the dignity and contributions of all people are seen, valued, and celebrated as essential parts of our one shared human story.